Knowing how to assess and evaluate is probably one of the most important skills that a legal studies HSC student has to know. Anybody who's even done the smallest amount of legal studies at this stage, even if you're in year 11, will know that the syllabus calls for, again and again, the use of evaluation and assessment as a core part of the course. So if we start by having a look here at the crime part of the HSC course, it's obvious just by having a really simple look, not in the beginning because that's all introductory sort of things, but very soon, here we are in the second section, the criminal investigation process. You're asked to assess the effectiveness of something. Let's move down a little bit further. Again, in the third one, the criminal trial process, you're asked to assess the use of defences. You're asked to evaluate the effectiveness of juries. You're asked to assess the effectiveness of the criminal trial process, so on and so forth. Again and again, evaluate and assess comes up, not just in the crime topic, in the family topic, in the human rights topic, in the consumers topic, in the world order topic, whatever option you're doing, it's going to show up. So let's have a look at what these things might mean. And the most authoritative source for figuring this stuff out is obviously the Board of Studies itself. So if we go to the Board of Studies glossary site, we should be able to get an authoritative understanding of what these two things mean. So let's start with evaluation. To evaluate asks you to make a judgment based on criteria, determine the value of something. That's what evaluation is. You have to use a criteria in order to derive at some sort of judgment. Okay, let's roll up to assess. Assess here. Make a judgment of value, quality, outcomes, results, or size. For me, the assess is incredibly vague, and in fact, I think this is a real issue that plagues the HSC legal studies, is that assess is so poorly defined. In fact, as I'm about to demonstrate, markers themselves have had enormous difficulty figuring out exactly what it means, and subsequently that makes issues for you as a student. Exactly what do they want you to do when you assess, and exactly what they want you to do when you evaluate. The answer to that question is that you need to do the exact same thing, and here's the proof. Okay, so in 2014, a world order question asked you to evaluate the effectiveness, okay, of the legal and non-legal measures, blah, blah, blah. But it's asked you to evaluate the effectiveness. That's the command terminology. So here in the marking criteria, a good mark, so 21 to 25, makes an informed judgment explicitly or implicitly about its effectiveness. Huge problem here. Problem one, it's asked you to evaluate, and in the marking criteria, it's made no reference to a criteria. Enormously confusing. It's a simple matter of going back to our glossary, and we can quickly determine that, according to the board itself, if you're evaluating, you have to use a criteria. But if we click back to the way it was marked, they don't even mention a criteria. This is a complication. Don't worry, I have an answer for you that's going to make it nice and easy. Now let's roll on down to the same year, 2014, over in the consumers question, they ask you to assess the role of something. Okay, let's see how they get you to do that in the markers again. Top band, response, makes an informed judgment, explicit or implicit. Hang on, this is exactly the same thing. Evaluate the effectiveness, makes an informed judgment, explicit or implicit. Assess, makes an informed judgment, implicit or explicit. Okay, so clearly the terms are interchangeable. Even the markers are not differentiating between evaluate and assessment. So to further prove the point, let's have a look in 2013. 2013, the family question, evaluate how effective, evaluate the effectiveness question. Here in the marking criteria, top band response, makes an informed judgment implicitly or explicitly. The exact same as the above, okay? Now, here is where things get even more kooky and a bit bizarre. 2012, the shelter question, assess the role of government. Here it is, 2012, question 29A, same thing. Top band response, makes an informed judgment based on a criteria. What is going on here? Sometimes they want a criteria, sometimes they don't. The simplest and easiest way of figuring this out, and for you to work through it as a student, is to use them interchangeably. Assess and effective, same thing. Okay, and the tip for that then, therefore, is use a criteria for both. Use a criteria for both. Okay, but what criteria should you use? That's the most obvious and pressing question. The answer to that can be found actually by looking at the Legal Studies Year 11 course. here underneath the guys, can't quite remember what topic that is. It's not even particularly important. I'm wasting your time. I'm sorry. Under the law and practice topic, there is a nice, neat set of criteria provided for us. Criteria to evaluate the effectiveness could include resource efficiency, accessibility, enforceability, responsiveness, protection of individual rights, meeting society's needs, application of the rule of law, and has justice been achieved. These are clearly could include. This is not a complete list, and if you chose different criteria, they cannot fault you on that because they're just saying you could include them. However, these are used universally. The New South Wales State Library uses it on its excellent legal studies resource that you'll find online. Have a look. Study guides use it, and I use it. So, not that I'm particularly authoritative, but I support it. It is an excellent way of going about evaluating the effectiveness. Okay, so how do we go about using these? Well, I constructed around the mnemonic of pair jam. Okay, every single one of those 8 criteria line up with one of these mnemonics: pair jam, pair jam, pair jam. And when you come to writing your essays in the HSC in that 45 minutes and you're stressed, you want to just quickly jot the words pair jam at the top of your paper, and then you've got your criteria there in front of you, and you can quickly pick out 1 or 2 to use as your criteria when you write. So what is pair jam? Let's have a bit of a look at each of these. Pair jam, first of all, is spelt incorrectly. It's spelt with a double R. That's the only way that was going to make it work. So let's quickly run through each criteria. The P is protection of individuals' rights, and you may at this point want to pause the video and you can have a bit of a look or jot these down without having to listen to me. Protection of individuals' rights: are individuals looked after by this law? Are human beings' rights infringed? This is really great criteria to use for any crime paper or any human rights question that you might get. Are individuals being damaged or not looked after by the legislation that's in place? Enforceability: is it even possible to enforce a law? This is a huge issue with international law. It's written, it's supported, but at the crunch, it's difficult to enforce. So this is really useful to use on essays in relation to international law or world order or human rights. Accessibility: is the law difficult to access? Is it expensive? Is it time consuming? Is it unduly stressful or complex for somebody to use, get themselves into court, get a remedy for whatever they're experiencing? This is really common in family and in crime. Resource efficiency: are we throwing heaps of resources in order to enforce this law? Is it unduly expensive? Are there cheaper and more appropriate ways of going about getting the outcome that we want rather than spending all this money? So some people might argue with crime, locking people in prison for certain offences is hugely expensive, whereas it might be much easier to offer diversionary programs or things that address the causes of crime rather than spending the thousands of dollars a day and locking them up. Responsiveness: sorry, I won't scroll away from that. Responsiveness: does the law keep up with society's needs? Does it do what we want it to do? Is it out of date? Is it behind the times? This is common in consumers when businesses offer new products or they come up with new advertising means of advertising, and consumers and society is dissatisfied with it, but the law hasn't yet changed. So has the law kept pace with what we want? The jam component is quite straightforward. Justice: does it create fair outcomes? Is it moral? Is it something that appeals to your sense of justice? This is common, I think, in crime, but world order is also the tip where it might be useful. Application of the rule of law: are people treated equally by the law? Are some people privileged or discriminated by the law? This is common in crime and family and consumers. Certain people do better in the law than others, so that's a useful thing on those topics. And meeting society's needs: this is similar to one mentioned above, but this is where, does it do what society wants it to do? Society has evolved and changed, so has the law kept pace? So socially we might change in relation to same-sex marriage. The statistics suggest that in fact the vast majority of Australians are in favour. However, the law still denies people access. Use of technology, for instance. Technology flows ahead, leaps and bounds year in, year out, and the law is left trying to desperately catch up. So things like privacy are often not protected. This is meeting society's needs is useful in family, crime, and consumers. So these are things that you're going to need to keep in mind as you start writing your papers. there's a lot to remember. There's many different things here, and we're chunking it together. It's a really useful technique, this mnemonic, for all sorts of things throughout all of your HSC courses, is when you have big long lists of things to remember, bring it into a nice catchy statement that is just going to roll off the tongue, and then you can very quickly use, and then you can refer back to, and you're not wasting all that working memory and even long-term memory during the exam process. So pair jam is what you need to recall. Now, the next step is how to write a paper where you actually assess the effectiveness or evaluate the effectiveness. We're going to do that in the next video tutorial. So click on the link and that will take you through to how to actually write an essay.